Hi everyone, and welcome to this first episode of our Papertalk, Catching Up with Research. I'm Timo, a student assistant in the group for Political Urbanism and Sustainable Spatial Development. In this series, I'll be catching up with the research my colleagues are doing every day and sharing key ideas from it with you. This week, we are going to discuss Jean-David and Jean-Françoise Gerber's 2016 paper, Decommodification as a Foundation for Ecological Economies, published in Ecological Economies. Gerber and Gerber begin their paper with the observation of a strong emphasis on commodification processes in the literature of ecological economics, an overemphasis in the author's view, as it went hand in hand with the neglect of the opposite phenomenon, decommodification. Indeed, the declared aim of the paper is to demonstrate the relevance of the study of decommodification for the field of ecological economics. In a first theoretical point, they take up Gunnar Heinsohn and Otto Steiger's theory of ownership in order to derive a foundation of decommodification processes based on the dichotomy between property and possession and connected to ecological sustainability. In a second empirical step, titled Decommodification in Practice, they analyze examples of decommodification processes from Switzerland. However, before we follow Jean-David and Jean-Françoise through theory and practice, it is worth going back to the introduction, where commodification and decommodification are defined. Thus, commodification describes the process of viewing utilities as commodities to be paid for or traded, rather than as entitlements. Crucially, the commodification of a good or service changes the relationship we have with it. Gerber and Gerber write, a shift in management practices and objectives takes place. Goods and services that are considered commodities become exposed to a form of rationality that incorporates monetary cost-benefit considerations. In contrast, decommodification describes the strength of social entitlements and a citizen's degree of immunization from market dependency. With this in mind, we can now turn our attention to two further concepts: property and possession. According to Heinsohn and Steiger, possession refers to the physical control of resources and regulates the material reproduction of all societies. It is a characteristic that belongs to goods and services in the first place. Property, on the other hand, always exists in addition to possession. It is based on the emission of state-enforceable titles that ultimately allow the commodification of the possessed good through sale, lease, credit, and debt transactions. So what is the relevance of decommodification for ecological economies? Gerber and Gerber argue that the perception of possession as property is linked to a specific economic logic, one that often has profoundly negative effects on ecological sustainability. Suddenly, natural resources such as land and water, but also pollution, become subjects of sale. With this transformation, resources get extracted from their socio-cultural and ecological context, while trade value comes to the fore. Now, they describe decommodification as ways of going back to a logic of possession, and thus as the post-growth transition desired by so many ecological economists. This is because property-based arrangements would lack a built-in growth imperative. Indeed, Decommodification introduces a different logic in the relationship between societies and the environment, allowing shifts in the balance between long-term and short-term considerations, between efficiency and democracy, and between conservation and exploitation. Okay, now we understand that the possession logic transition is what we need. Fair enough. But the Greenpeace newsletter in my inbox against deep-sea mining shows that the resource space underlying property logic is actually expanding. So how does large-scale decommodification work? Gerber and Gerber describe different pathways that the process of decommodification can take. They differ, among other things, in the actor who undertakes them. They identify a first path in the individual, who decides to no longer view their own property in terms of its exchange value, but instead to focus on its use value. A second path is seen in movements of collectivization or nationalization, which can follow a possession logic. They mention housing here as an example. Finally, they formulate a deeper institutional shift towards collective possession as a third possibility. This path would correspond in practice to a new bundle of rights over public service and a more radical legal regulation of the economy towards an overarching post-growth program. They now seek to back their theoretical argument, namely that ecological and social sustainability can be achieved by overcoming property logic with evidence from three economic sectors that would have already overcome a state of pure commodification. The cases are taken from Switzerland, a liberal economy characterized by very strong defined property rights. They start by looking at housing cooperative, an example already mentioned in relation to the collectivization path. Housing cooperatives are private actors that achieve decommodification decisively through the legal form as an association. As such, they are in principle non-profit oriented. The rents are calculated according to the principle of cost rent, which keeps rents low, especially in the long term after initial investments have been paid off. Public utility housing cooperatives also benefit from an official recognition through the national government. This official distinction allows public actors to support them, in particular through preferential access to public building land. A further implication of the legal form of housing cooperatives is the fact that voting power in decisions is not based on an actual number of shares, for example based on the amount of cooperative capital contributed, but on the one human, one vote principle. This mechanism guarantees the long-term perpetuation of the decommodified good following a logic of possession, as it protects members from unilateral decisions taken by individual members. But how influential are housing cooperatives in Switzerland actually? Gerber and Gerber acknowledge dwelling provided by housing cooperatives hardly influence rent settings in the vast stock of housing. And housing cooperatives were currently unable to keep pace with the general construction boom to maintain their share. The main reason for this was the lack of affordable land in urban centers. This offers a perfect bridge to the next example of decommodification cited by Gerber's, public land ownership. Municipal land could be considered partially decommodified if municipalities did not seek to manage the land for profit, but instead maintain a possession-based logic, for example by lending their building rights to housing cooperatives at a price below market value. However, in order to allocate land in this way, the public actor must first own it. In addition to administrative assets, the infrastructure required to fulfill public tasks, many cities in Switzerland today own a large stock of land. Land whose acquisition was historically motivated primarily by the supply for affordable housing and to fight speculation on the housing market. Finally, Gerber and Gerber take up the case of forests. Once the Forest Act of 1902 came into power, it actually became impossible to convert forests to other land uses. As it applies to both public and private forests, the law was a powerful measure to decommodify forest land. By removing forested land from the overall land market, it guarantees the preservation of the stock and prevents, on the long term, its conversion to other uses. Also, by regulating access, it stops privatized uses of the forest, making the resource available to all. Based on these two factors, strong regulation and guarantee of access, 1/3 of the area of Switzerland could be considered decommodified. Gerber and Gerber have now discussed 3 sectors that are at least partially decommodified. This partially is important because it refers to the dynamic coexistence of institutional arrangements which the authors address in their concluding remarks. There is a constant struggle for or against the commodification of certain aspects of the economy. Decommodified goods, following a logic of possessions, are constantly under attack by property and its logic of expansion. But, on the other side, resistance organizes and social movements develop political strategies to contest this tendency, they state. Paradoxically, decommodifications in advanced capitalist economies could contribute to citizens accepting commodification in other areas of life more easily and thus even contribute to its preservation.